Nurses of Reddit, what were the most haunting things someone said on their deathbed?
I was cleaning him up and his monitor started going off as he went into a bad rhythm. I pressed the code button to get his nurse, and as we waited he took my hand and said, "Don't sorry son, I'm ready. Thank you for taking care of me." He was a DNR, so we just let him go peacefully.
I had to tell my grandmother that dialysis would only give her another week or so to live, and it was her choice to try or not. She was in and out of consciousness at that point and was in a clear state for the moment. She asked, "Will I die?" I said, "Yes." She looked me in the eye and smiled just a little and said, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." She closed her eyes, squeezed my hand and slept until she passed a day later. When things get hard, I always hear her say, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." Edit, I did not expect such a response. You've all warmed my heart and made me laugh a few times too. Thank you, and I'm really happy to see my grandma's resolve to go the way of all flesh with dignity has touched so many.
She looked at me and said, "You really are a little pipsqueak." I was her favorite nurse too.
Not a nurse, but my grandfather was put into a 24/7 care home with severe Parkinson's. My mom and grandma had spent 4 years basically taking care of him constantly and needed a break for a couple weeks, although visiting him every other day in shifts. I went one day alone, and he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I need you to get me home so I can die, I can't do it here." I tried saying everything I could to the nurses and my family to get him home without saying what he told me. 24 hours later he got rushed to emerge. As he was dying he looked at me and said, "Don't let it bother you," and died. Still bothers me. Edit, I really just wanted to get this off my chest and sleep. I didn't anticipate the powerful dialogues with you all honestly. Thank you so much, Red Heart.
While in hospice my grandma said to me, there are a great many things in this world worse than dying." Then talked about how lucky she was to have lived the life she did. I had never looked at death like that before, and that conversation truly changed me and my outlook. She was the most wonderful person.
My great-uncle's last words before he passed were, "It is what it is." I know it's really common, but I find myself saying it quite a lot nowadays. It is what it is. My great, and who lived to be 101, was straight vegetative for like a month or so before passing, the day after her 101st birthday. On the day of her birthday, she suddenly was conscious and awake as everybody had come to leave a birthday cake. She told stories and laughed. Then she went back to being comatose and died the next day. Woman loved her birthday lol. Edit winky face, went to work and came back to this having exploded lol. I have been enjoying the conversation begun here though.
My patient grabbed my arm, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Please don't let me die, I have a daughter."
About 2 minutes before my grandma passed she had clarity. She'd suffered from severe dementia for years. She opened her eyes and said, "I found Jack, my grandpa who died 8 years prior." She said they were at a ball with their friends. Then she said, "I've gotta go, he asked me to dance." Then she was gone.
I'm going to die. I know I'm going to die. He was going for very routine, fairly minor surgery. I held his hand and told him he would be fine. He died shortly after the procedure.
Many moons ago when I was a nursing student, a man in his 40s was lying on his deathbed from terminal cancer, his sobbing wife lying in bed next to him. He looked at his wife, using the last bit of energy he had to gently wipe away her tears and stroke her cheek. He took off his oxygen mask and said, "Don't worry love, don't be afraid. It's just death," and passed shortly after.
Physical therapist here. I treated a man in his 90s who was a DNR/DNI. At least once a week when I would go to his room to start our sessions he would cry and say I didn't want to kill the kids. After speaking to his nurse, it was revealed that he had killed children in WW2. He collapsed during a session and said, "The kids are here to get me." He died a few minutes later. Edit, he wasn't displaying fear when he verbalized this after he collapsed. He seemed at peace.
Looked after a guy with end-stage heart failure. He kept having episodes where if he coughed or leaned forward anything to increase his intrathoracic pressure, he would pass out. He would come back after a few minutes and gradually go from purple back to pink. How long was I out for that time? He was fully mentally fine, sharp, witty, and at peace with what was going to eventually happen to him. Him and me were joking that one of these episodes were going to kill him, as he sipped his tea, and we talked rubbish. 5 minutes later it happened again, and he didn't come back. He had a DNR order which was sensible. Very eerie to talk to somebody so vibrant and alert minutes before he died. Such a nice dude. I want to be in that mindset when I go too.
I started my nursing career on a palliative unit. In my first 3 months as a RN, I pronounced 7 deaths. This one patient had advanced dementia and often believed he was at work while he was awake in the hospital. He would often give us, the nurses and care aides, tasks and jobs to do, as he believed himself to be our superior. One day near the end of December, he asks me, "When is New Year's? What day is it this year?" I tell him New Year's will be the upcoming Tuesday. He nods and tells me that he thinks he's going to have to quit after the new year. This job is getting too difficult for him and he can't keep up. It's time to retire. I tell him we appreciate all the hard work he's done and will miss him terribly when he's gone, that he was a great employee and we all loved working with him. That Tuesday, January 1st, he passed away peacefully in his sleep at 0200. I will never forget that conversation. Edit, some missed/misspelled words.
Former CNA in the dementia unit of an assisted living facility. My dad is on his way to pick me up now. She said that every time I checked on her, until she died about a week after it started. While she was still mobile, she would tidy her room and sit on the edge of her bed and just wait most of the day.
I didn't mean to. We were sending this middle-aged guy home after his ER visit. As soon as we moved him off the bed, he went unresponsive and had no heartbeat. We did a couple rounds of CPR, and he began to come to. He blinked a couple times, and the doctor running the code jokingly said, "Sir, you almost died on us." The man said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," in a sad way. His heart then stopped again, and we couldn't get him back. Since a lot of you are asking, it was most likely a saddle pulmonary embolism. He was there for something pretty mild, but he threw a clot right when he was being transferred. If you want to look it up, he had classic cape cyanosis across his chest, which is indicative of a big PE.
My stepfather passed away last year. Towards the end he was very cranky and hadn't treated my mother very kindly. Before he lost consciousness he was stroking her face saying "beautiful, beautiful," that made me happy.
I had a nonverbal patient overnight that was in for something pretty routine. Around 6:30 at the end of my shift I walked by his room and smiled at him. He waved to me. 1 minute later he coded and wasn't able to be revived.
My grandmother grasped the nurse's hand and said, "I think I'm going to die now." The nurse was telling her no, she was doing much better, and would likely leave soon, but my grandmother was gone before she could finish her sentence. She knew.
I'm a nursing student in Canada, and on my palliative rotation I had a patient that was getting medically assisted dying the next day. He was an elderly cancer patient. He told me he was a self-ordained minister, nothing official but an at-home type preacher, and that I could confess to him anything I wanted. I humored him and whispered to him some of my biggest secrets. I figured who cares, he was going to die tomorrow anyway. He told me it was all right, and I could tell he appreciated that I confided in him. He also told me his email address and said that while he would not be sending emails in return, he would be receiving them. He was a cool guy.
I'm scared elderly gentleman. Worsening congestive heart failure, incapacitated, and his wife put him on hospice. He was comfort measures only. I was at the nurse's station, and I could hear him starting to gasp for air. I walked into the room, and he was struggling to breathe. I put my stethoscope up to his back, but I already knew what was happening. His lungs were full of fluid. I sat him up in bed and he stared at me, eyes wide open, head tilted slightly back, facial expression was full-blown panic. I'm scared. Immediately after he said the words, his oxygen mask started filling up with pink/red frothy foam, running down his face and dripping onto his gown. He was dead within minutes, and all I could do was watch him. I will never forget his face.
My brother was with a friend of his when the friend had a massive heart attack. While waiting for an ambulance, the guy suddenly shouted, "Oh, it's coming," then looked my brother dead in the eyes and said, "It was nice to know you," and died less than 30 seconds later.
Not an ER staff member, but a first responder. Had a guy take some shrapnel from a metal working rig. Was bleeding out from his chest. Was up walking and talking, but bleeding. Within minutes, he started gasping for air. Before he became unconscious, he said, "I need to call my mom."
Had a patient screaming out, "They're coming to get me," and calling for help. He died shortly after.
My dad was in the hospital and found out he had lung cancer. It was him, my stepmom, and a nurse in the room. He told my stepmom to get him something just to get her to leave the room. The nurse said that before she could stop him, he took off his oxygen mask, said, "I'm done," and he lost consciousness immediately. He was on life support for a day or so, but he was already gone. When we pulled the plug, his body died in less than 5 minutes. I guess he really was done.
I sat hospice with my best friend. She had breast cancer, and held it off for 8 years. At the very end, I was holding her hand for the last thing she said. "I don't want to die." She really didn't. Wish she was still here.
How will I explain this mess? Pointing to his butt, second hand from a close ER nurse. Lad comes in after a car accident. His work van had flipped and rolled. The fella was wheeled and fully conscious, no pain, after EMS or disorientation. However, he was completely twisted in half from the midsection down. There was no way he would survive untwisting, but the blood vessels must have been cinched in such a way that he didn't bleed out. The doctors and nurses explained the situation to him and suggested his family come to say goodbye. He looked like he was lounging on the couch watching TV with a blanket over his lower half. Once the realization set in, he replied with, "How will I explain this mess?"
Not a nurse, but when my great uncle was on his deathbed, he told the nurse, "Hey, can you do me a favor and go get my car keys? I'm ready to go." The nurse went and got the keys, and he died before she got back with them.
I'm only 18. That shit never leaves you. She had skin cancer all over from a childhood event of her cousin pushing her into boiling water, and eventually couldn't even roll over without writhing in pain. It was the worst experience of my life. I shortly left inpatient nursing after that.
You know what's funny? Everyone says living is the hard part. No, dying is much harder than living. Cancer patient in their 40s who was incredibly active and athletic up until their diagnosis said this to me as a student in my hospice clinical. Stuck with me ever since.
Not a nurse, but was a cop, and I was with a 20-year-old who took his own life. He checked into a nice hotel and his parents reported him missing. Anyways, they found out he was in a hotel by a credit card charge. I was the responding officer, and when I arrived, I knocked on the door. He answered and was really cool. We chatted for a few minutes and I asked him if he was willing to come downstairs to meet with his parents. He went back into his room and I held the door open. It appeared he was putting on a jacket, but he pulled out a gun, placed it on his temple and said, "Fuck my family, this is on them," and pulled the trigger. First time someone mauled themselves in front of me, and wasn't the last. That shit haunts you years later.